Have you ever seen a security checkpoint shut down because someone walked through it with what looked like impossible clearance? Lieutenant Marcus Chen had been stationed at Gateway Outpost 17 for 3 years, and he'd never seen anything like what happened that Tuesday morning. The main entrance scanners erupted in cascading blue light, alarm klaxons went silent mid-wail, and every screen in the facility flashed the same message: High Commander access granted. But here's what made his blood run cold: the person triggering that clearance looked barely old enough to be out of the academy, and she had two massive predator cubs flanking her like trained bodyguards. The girl who walked through those doors had platinum hair that caught the sterile station lights like starlight, delicate features that would have been completely human except for the subtle points of her ears, and eyes that held the kind of weight you only saw in combat veterans. She wore tactical pants in charcoal gray and a fitted jacket with iridescent panels that shifted between silver and violet, looking every bit like she belonged on a recruitment poster for some elite unit Marcus had never heard of. The cubs, and there was no other word for what they were, stood as high as her waist, covered in crystalline fur that refracted light into rainbow patterns, with intelligent golden eyes that swept the corridor with military precision. Marcus's hand had gone to his sidearm on instinct. "Identify yourself," he called out, his voice steadier than he felt. The girl stopped, tilted her head slightly, and for a moment he thought she might actually smile. "My name is Lyra," she said, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't place, musical, but with an edge like a blade wrapped in silk. "And I'm here to save your station before you all die in approximately 72 hours. The words hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Behind her, one of the cubs made a low thrumming sound that Marcus felt in his chest rather than heard. "Security to main entrance," he spoke into his cum, not taking his eyes off her. "I need verification on this High Commander clearance. Now." The response crackled back almost instantly, and the voice was his commanding officer, Colonel Reeves, and she sounded shaken. "Stand down, Lieutenant. Escort our guest to command immediately." Marcus had questions about 1,000 of them, but military training overrode curiosity. He gestured toward the inner station. "This way, ma'am." As they walked, he couldn't help but study her from the corner of his eye. She moved with the fluid confidence of someone who'd never questioned her right to be anywhere. But there was something else there too, a tightness around her eyes, a way her fingers occasionally brushed against the nearest cub's crystalline fur, as if drawing comfort from the contact. The creatures themselves were a mystery. He'd served on 3 different frontier stations and never encountered anything like them. They didn't make aggressive moves, but their presence commanded respect the way a loaded weapon did, dangerous, even at rest. "They won't hurt anyone unless I'm threatened," Lyra said, without looking at him, as if she'd felt his unease. "Kira and Zen have been with me since they were born. Where I go, they go." "What are they?" Marcus asked, then immediately wondered if that was rude. She did smile then, just a little. "On my world, we call them lumen wolves. They bond with one person for life. These 2 chose me when I was 15. There was a story there, Marcus could tell, layers of meaning in the way her voice softened. They passed through 3 more security checkpoints, each one lighting up with that same High Commander access alert, and each time, the guards looked more confused. By the time they reached command, half the senior staff had assembled, looking like they'd been pulled from various duties in a hurry. Colonel Reeves stood at the center, a woman in her 50s, with iron gray hair and the kind of eyes that had seen too many young soldiers not come home. When she saw Lyra, something complex crossed her face: recognition, disbelief, and what might have been old grief. "Stars above," Reeves breathed. "You look just like her." Lyra's composure cracked, just for a second, and Marcus saw pain flash across her features before she locked it down. "I'm told I have my mother's eyes," she said quietly. The room went still. Marcus felt like he'd walked into the middle of a conversation in a language he didn't speak. Reeves stepped forward, her military bearing softening. "Arya Stormborn was the finest officer I ever served under. When we lost her at the Sigma conflict 15 years ago, we lost the war's turning point. She saved 17 colonies with her final action." She looked at Lyra with something approaching reverence. "We gave her the posthumous rank of High Commander. The access codes were supposed to be ceremonial, passed to her family. You never thought anyone would use them," Lyra finished. "I wouldn't have, except my mother left me something besides her clearance." She left me a warning, encoded in a data crystal programmed to open only on my 25th birthday. 3 days ago, I unsealed it. She pulled a small device from her jacket pocket, and the lumen wolves shifted position, flanking her more closely. Marcus noticed they were watching the room's other occupants, not her, always alert to external threats. My mother discovered something during the Sigma conflict, something she didn't have time to report before she died. There's a species called the Veiled. They exist in a quantum state that makes them invisible to most sensors. They infiltrate stations, colonies, ships, studying their targets for months before they strike. They hollow out the infrastructure from within, then trigger a cascade failure that looks like an accident. She met Reeves's gaze. Gateway Outpost 17 is currently hosting 14 veiled infiltrators, and they're 48 hours from activating a reactor breach that will destroy the station and kill all 4,000 people aboard. The room erupted in protests and questions. But Marcus found himself watching Lyra's face, reading the micro-expressions that flickered there. She wasn't lying. He'd interrogated enough suspects to know the difference between deception and desperate truth. That's impossible, one of the other officers said. Our sensors would detect any unauthorized presence. Your sensors can't see them, Lyra said, and there was frustration in her voice now, urgency bleeding through her controlled exterior. That's the point. But the lumen wolves can. They perceive across quantum states. It's why my mother had one with her during the war, why she was so effective at rooting out veiled scouts. She looked down at Kira and Zen, her hand resting on Kira's head. It's why I brought them. They've already identified 3 infiltrators in this room alone. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Everyone suddenly looked at everyone else with suspicion. Marcus's hand went back to his sidearm. Where? Reeves demanded. Lyra closed her eyes, and Marcus saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer or a meditation. When she opened them again, they seemed to glow faintly, a bioluminescence he hadn't noticed before. The lumen wolves moved in perfect synchronization, positioning themselves to face 3 different points in the room: air ventilation grate, a gap behind a control console, and a shadow in the corner that seemed slightly darker than it should be. They're there, and there, Lyra said. Don't try to shoot them. Conventional weapons pass right through until they choose to become solid. Then how do we fight them? Marcus asked. For the first time, Lyra looked uncertain. My mother's notes mentioned a resonance frequency that forces them into a single quantum state, making them vulnerable. But she never completed the research. I've spent 3 days trying to replicate her work, and I think I have it. But she hesitated. And in that moment, she looked less like a mysterious woman with impossible clearance and more like someone carrying a burden too heavy for one person. But testing it means revealing ourselves to them. If I'm wrong, they'll accelerate their timeline, and we'll all die today instead of in 3 days. The choice hung in the air like a blade. Reeves was the one who spoke. If we do nothing, we die anyway. At least this way we're fighting. She looked at Lyra with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Your mother never asked permission to do the impossible either. Show us what you've got. What followed was the strangest 6 hours of Marcus's life. Lyra worked with the station's engineers, translating her mother's 15-year-old research notes into something their systems could execute, while the lumen wolves maintained constant vigilance, tracking the veiled infiltrators as they moved through the station's walls and systems. Marcus was assigned as Lyra's personal security, which meant he spent those hours watching her work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She was brilliant, that became obvious within minutes, but she was also running on fumes, her hands occasionally shaking before she'd force them steady, her eyes haunted by something more than just the current crisis. During a brief break while the engineers fabricated a component, Marcus found her in the observation lounge, staring out at the stars, with Kira and Zen pressed against her legs. You didn't have to come here alone, he said quietly. She didn't turn around. Yes, I did. My mother died stopping these things, and apparently I'm the only one who inherited whatever genetic quirk lets me see them. With the lumen wolves' help, no one else even believed they existed until I arrived with proof. That's a lot of weight for one person. I've been carrying my mother's legacy my whole life, Lyra said, and there was a bitter edge to her voice now. Do you know what it's like growing up as the daughter of a hero? Everyone expects you to be just like her, brave, brilliant, unstoppable. No one asks if you're scared. No one considers that maybe you wanted a different life. She finally looked at him, and Marcus was struck by the vulnerability in her eyes, the way her control was fraying at the edges. I wanted to be a xenobiologist. I wanted to study life, not death. But she left me this warning, this mission. And if I ignore it, 4,000 people die. So here I am, pretending I know what I'm doing, praying I don't get everyone killed. Marcus took a step closer carefully, the way you approach something wounded and wild. For what it's worth, you're doing better than most of the officers I've served under. And you're not alone anymore. Something shifted in her expression, a crack in the armor, and for a moment he thought she might actually let herself lean on someone else. Then the comms system crackled to life. We're ready for the test, the chief engineer's voice announced. Lyra's mask slammed back into place. But when she walked past Marcus toward the door, her hand briefly touched his arm. A gesture of gratitude that lasted less than a second but felt like a connection forged in steel. The test was conducted in a sealed section of the station, with half the security force on standby and the other half evacuating nearby civilians as a precaution. Lyra stood at the control panel, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface, while the lumen wolves positioned themselves in the center of the room. The frequency needs to be channeled through a living conduit, she explained, her voice steady, despite the stakes. The lumen wolves will act as amplifiers. If this works, it'll force every veiled on the station into a visible, solid state for approximately 30 seconds. That's our window to tag them with quantum markers so we can track them permanently. And if it doesn't work? Reeves asked. Then they know we can see them, and they'll likely trigger the reactor breach immediately. We'll have maybe 10 minutes to evacuate, which isn't enough time. Lyra's hand hovered over the activation switch. Everyone should clear the room. If this goes wrong, we're staying, Marcus said, and several other officers nodded. Lyra looked at them, at him, and for a moment her composure broke enough to show what that solidarity meant to her. Then she activated the sequence. The lumen wolves began to glow, their crystalline fur blazing with light that seemed to come from another dimension entirely. A sound filled the room, not quite music, but not quite noise, a harmonic frequency that made Marcus's teeth ache and his vision blur. Lyra's eyes were completely luminous now, her whole body outlined in the same ethereal light. And he realized she wasn't just operating the equipment, she was part of the circuit, channeling something through herself that no human was meant to touch. The air rippled, and suddenly they were visible. 14 entities materialized throughout the station, appearing on every monitor, caught in the frequency like insects in amber. They were vaguely humanoid, but wrong in ways that hurt to look at, their forms shifting between states of matter, their faces, if you could call them that, expressing something that might have been surprise. Tag them, Reeves shouted, and the tactical team moved with practiced precision, firing specialized markers that adhered to the veiled even as they flickered and phased. 30 seconds. That's what Lyra had said they had. Marcus counted everyone, watching Lyra's face as the strain of maintaining the frequency carved lines of agony into her features. 28 seconds. All 14 targets tagged. Shut it down, the chief engineer called, but Lyra was already collapsing, the light fading from her eyes as she crumpled. Marcus caught her before she hit the ground, and the lumen wolves were there instantly, pressing against her, their own light dimming as if they'd poured everything they had into the effort. Medical team to the lab, Marcus shouted, but Lyra's eyes fluttered open, unfocused but conscious. Did it work? She whispered. It worked, he told her, and meant it as a promise and a gratitude. The next 48 hours were a controlled chaos of hunting down the now trackable veiled, neutralizing their sabotage, and reinforcing the station's quantum shielding to prevent future infiltration. Lyra recovered slowly, the cost of channeling that much energy through her body, leaving her weak and shaking. Marcus stayed close, officially as her security detail, unofficially as something neither of them had named yet. On the third day, with the crisis resolved and the station saved, he found her in the observation lounge again, the lumen wolf sleeping at her feet for the first time since she'd arrived. She looked different now, still tired, still carrying that weight of legacy, but also lighter somehow. As if sharing the burden had made it bearable. Reeves is recommending you for a permanent position, Marcus said, settling into the seat beside her. Wants you to head up a new task force hunting the veiled across the frontier. Lyra smiled faintly. I heard. I'm considering it. She looked at him, and there was something new in her expression, a tentative openness. What about you? I'm told I can pick my own team. Marcus's heart did something complicated in his chest. I'm a security officer, not exactly special forces material. You caught me when I fell, Lyra said softly. You believed me when everyone else thought I was crazy. You see me, not just my mother's shadow. She reached out, her hand, finding his, fingers intertwining with a natural ease that felt like it had always been meant to happen. I think that makes you exactly the right kind of person. He squeezed her hand gently, marveling at how something as simple as touch could feel like a promise. Then I guess you're stuck with me, she laughed, and it was the first time he'd heard the sound, bright and real and beautiful. Good. Because I have a feeling this is just the beginning. If the veiled are active again after 15 years of silence, something big is coming. And I'm going to need people I trust watching my back. Always, Marcus said, and meant it with everything in him. Kira raised her head, making that thrumming sound that might have been approval, and Zen's tail thumped once against the floor. Outside the viewport, the stars wheeled in their ancient dance, indifferent to human drama. But inside that small observation lounge, something new had been forged, a team, a purpose, and the fragile beginning of something that felt like hope. As they sat together in comfortable silence, Lyra's head eventually resting against Marcus's shoulder, he thought about the girl who'd walked through security 3 days ago with impossible clearance and predator cubs as bodyguards, triggering alarms and appending everything they thought they knew. She'd come to save them, carrying her mother's legacy like a weight and a weapon, and in the process, she'd found something she hadn't been looking for: a place to belong, people who saw her for herself, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to write her own story instead of living in someone else's shadow. The High Commander access that had brought her here was her mother's gift, but what she did with it from here would be entirely her own. And Marcus had a feeling they were all about to discover just how extraordinary Lyra Stormborn could be, when she stopped trying to be her mother and started being herself. 3 months later, the task force was official, operating out of a modified frigate called the Lumenwing in honor of Lyra's companions. They'd tracked down 6 more veiled infiltration attempts, saved 2 colonies and a military convoy, and become something of a legend in frontier space: the girl with the glowing eyes and her Lumenwolf bodyguards, the security officer who'd become her right hand, and the small crew of specialists who could see the invisible and fight the impossible. But that's another story.